gods love kill.
Sweet child of mine! Thor Love and Thunder shows that there is life after Ragnarok and that all's fair in love and Thor. And this time around, the Odinson and Stormbreaker are joined by a Mjolnir-wielding Jane Foster, aka the Mighty Thor. Directed by Taika Waititi, the God of Thunder's fourth solo film pits both Thors against a Gorr who literally has God Butcher as his job title. What could go wrong? We'll break that down, what it means for the MCU, and what the mid-credits scene sets up, and round up all the Easter eggs we could spot, and trust me, there were a whole bunch. But before we get into all that, I have to warn you, we are about to spoil everything about this movie, so if you haven't seen Thor Love and Thunder quite yet, or you just want to draw your own conclusions, now's the time to make like a rainbow in the dark and Bifrost yourself on out of here while we break this down.
Let's see who you are. I take off your disguise. And flick! Oh. Flick too hard, damn it!
Okay, now that we're past the spoiler warning, let's get to the big takeaways. Dr. Jane Foster returns as the Mighty Thor thanks to Mjolnir, who is also back in action. Thor got his groove back and ditched the Asgardians of the Galaxy so that they can close out their trilogy. Gorr the God Butcher kidnaps a bunch of kids from New Asgard to draw Thor and Stormbreaker into a trap so that Thor, Mighty Thor, and Valkyrie team up to get them back. This leads them to an Easter egg-filled Omnipotent City where Thor throws Zeus's own lightning bolt through his chest. The Thors make it to the Shadow Realm to fight Gorr and obviously defeat him, but not before he reaches the wish-granting eternity and brings his dead daughter back to life. Thor adopts Gorr's orphan and takes her superhero around the universe because Jane has died of cancer, which is very sad. In the post-credits, though, we found out that shockingly Zeus is still alive and he's bringing in Hercules to give Thor the business, and Dr. Jane may have passed on from this mortal coil, but she has awoken in Valhalla, greeted by none other than Idris Elba's Heimdall, so maybe we haven't seen the last of either of them. Phew! Alright, I know that was a lot to dump on you all at once, so let's back up and recap a little bit to explain it, hopefully. The film opens on the origin story for Gorr the God Butcher. He and his daughter are seemingly the last surviving members of a race of people wiped out by famine and drought. She kicks the bucket, making Gorr the sole survivor. After he buries her and spends some time wandering the desert, he stumbles upon an oasis, and wouldn't you know it, there's a god living and thriving there and seemingly kicking back and enjoying some nice papayas. He also just so happens to be the god that Gorr and his people worship, hoping that he would come save them from their mortal perils, or at the very least that their suffering would have some kind of divine payoff. Gorr tells him all this, but this is one callous and indifferent god. Conveniently, when Gorr showed up, this god was celebrating the defeat of somebody who'd been trying to kill him with the Necro Sword, an ancient weapon with a ton of Marvel backstory. We'll fill you in on all that later in the video, so stick around. Love and Thunder is full of semi-sentient weapons, and the Necro Sword is one of them, and it chooses Gorr, and Gorr chooses to use it to slay his first god, who is the guy who was just laughing at him because his daughter died. And that's basically his deal. He feels like the gods ignored and abandoned him in his time of need, which they kinda did, and his response is to try to destroy all of the gods, which, you guessed it, includes Thor. Speaking of which, Thor has been working on himself since Endgame. He and the Guardians of the Galaxy help a peaceful bunch of aliens fend off some less peaceful invaders. It's a team effort, but Thor is clearly doing the heavy lifting.
Here it comes. This and here and now!
He even does the Jean-Claude Van Damme splits thing to destroy two enemy vehicles, which is pretty funny. As a reward for their heroics, Thor is given a pair of gigantic screaming space goats, which are hilarious and continue screaming for the rest of the film. On board the Benatar, Thor checks the Guardians' hotline voicemail and basically catches wind that somebody is wreaking havoc across the galaxy, including one from his old pal Lady Sif. So he strongly feels the need to go investigate, and he, Korg, and the Screaming Goats part ways with the Guardians to go do some god stuff.
Human handshake to the Asgardian shake. Into the snake that you cannot trust.
Really dragging this out.
And finish the classic Asgardian high one.
Which Star-Lord is totally okay with, and the Guardians bail, and they're not in any of the rest of the movie. Thor goes to investigate this big dead behemoth and runs into his old pal Sif, who's not quite dead but has lost an entire arm in battle. Anyway, as you might have guessed, the intergalactic troublemaker who's been killing gods here and there is none other than Gorr, and Sif informs him that yes, he's hunting gods, so Thor heads back to Earth to make sure that New Asgard is doing okay. And surprise, it's not! Gorr has used the Necro Sword to summon creatures from the Shadow Realm to terrorize all the Asgardians, but when Thor arrives, there's another Thor there defending New Asgard, the Mighty Thor, as in his ex-girlfriend, Dr. Jane Foster.
Jane?
Okay, so while Thor and the Guardians were fighting Skeksis, Jane was learning that she's got stage 4 cancer, as in basically incurable. In lieu of chemotherapy, she goes in search of Mjolnir, which she finds lying in immovable chunks under glass in New Asgard, which has become a tourist attraction under the savvy leadership of King Valkyrie. So long story short, during one of the many flashback montages explaining what happened between Thor and Jane, we learn that while still head over heels in love, Thor, wearing a hot dog costume, kinda drunk, told Mjolnir to guard over Jane and protect her, which the hammer was apparently still capable of doing, even after getting blown into chunks by Hela during Ragnarok. Jane magically gets Mjolnir to reform as one cohesive hammer, which she can also shoot out in a whole bunch of chunks to kill a bunch of people at once, which is pretty cool, but more importantly, Jane's symptoms are at bay when she's wielding it, and she has all the powers of a god of thunder as well, but the cancer, unfortunately, is still eating away at her when she's in human form. Anyway, Dr. Foster and Mr. Odinson wail on Gorr's shadow creatures, not realizing that they were a diversion to allow Gorr to capture all of the children of New Asgard, including Heimdall's son, who now goes by Axel because he's discovered Guns N' Roses, who do like 90% of the soundtrack for this movie. Realizing they're up against something evil and horrible, both Thor's Valkyrie and Korg use Stormbreaker and the goats to power a Viking longboat to travel to Omnipotent City, hangout of the gods. Along the way, Thor is able to have some psychic Zoom calls with Axel, who has inherited his father's magic eyesight, and Thor reassures the kids that he is on the way to come rescue them. In Omnipotent City, Thor requests help from Zeus, the king of the gods, in defeating Gorr, but Zeus and everyone else are kind of dicks about it and say that he's nothing to worry about, but they do reveal casually that he's trying to get to eternity, which is a being at the center of the galaxy that grants any wishes. Thor asks to borrow Zeus's lightning bolt, which is basically like if somebody asked him to borrow Mjolnir, and Zeus laughs in his face. Valkyrie and Mighty Thor and Korg get impatient and start cracking skulls. Korg gets blown into a pile of gravel but is apparently okay as long as his mouth is still intact, so Valkyrie turns him into a hair tie. Thor kills Zeus with his own lightning bolt, and they all hop in the goat boat and head in search of the kids, who Gorr has taken to a shadow realm where everything looks a lot less Jack Kirby and a lot more Frank Miller. When they get there, they don't find the kids, but they do find out that the key to eternity is in fact Stormbreaker, which is why Gorr has been using the kids as bait for Thor. Long story short, Gorr gets his hands on Stormbreaker and starts to open the door to eternity, but the gang shows up and finds the kids and frees them, and Thor tells them to get ready to fight, and they go pick up random crap laying around, which he endows with his own powers for a limited time only, and a bunch of kids in God mode proceed to beat the crap out of a horde of nightmarish Lovecraftian shadow creatures to the tune of the best part of Guns N' Roses' November Rain. You know the part. Jane basically sacrifices herself to save the children. Earlier in the film, Thor tells her that every time she becomes Mighty Thor, it saps more of her strength as Jane Foster. Knowing this, Jane still chooses to use Mjolnir in the final battle despite the fact that she knows that it'll kill her, and it does. Jane manages to use Mjolnir to shadow the Necrosword, which seemingly saps Gorr's powers, but despite all of this, he still does make it to eternity first, and as such, he gets his wish. The Thors follow him through the portal, and Jane's cancer has unfortunately caught up with her, and she's basically dying in Thor's arms. We were sort of hoping that Thor would get the wish first, and he would cure her cancer, and then everyone would live happily ever after, but it doesn't shake out that way. Thor does, however, convince Gorr not to use his wish for vengeance, as originally planned, but instead to choose love. Coincidentally, Love was apparently his daughter's nickname, so Gorr chooses to resurrect her instead of killing all the gods and whoever else was on his shit list. It's clear that Gorr is dying after he does this, and he even says though, but at last he's able to hug and kiss his little girl before he goes, and so it's a bittersweet ending. Jane is gone, but Thor basically has a daughter now, and they're gonna go superheroing around the galaxy. And also Korg met another rock man, and I guess they're holding hands and having a volcano baby? Another classic Thor adventure. It's a Marvel movie, so of course there are post-credits scenes. Love and Thunder follows the current standard practice of having one mid-credits scene and one at the very end. In the mid-credits scene, we get Hercules. It opens on Zeus, who's nursing a lightning bolt-sized hole in his chest, and he's grumbling about what literally happened in Omnipotent City and how people don't love gods anymore, they just like superheroes, and he's clearly talking to somebody. You know how these things go. They're basically setting up that last big reveal shot, and that last big reveal shot is what we were after. It is live-action Hercules, played by Brett Goldstein from Ted Lasso, better known as Roy Kent. He's here, he's there, he's Hercules. We only get the one shot of him, but it's pretty clear that Zeus is pissed at having his chest pierced with his own weapon, so he's sending in his boy Hercules, who actually got name-checked earlier in the film, to deliver some god-sized revenge to the God of Thunder himself. Hercules first appeared in Marvel Comics in Avengers number 10 in 1964 when he's summoned by the villain Immortus to mix it up with Thor, but it's later explained that this Hercules was just a space phantom in disguise. The real Hercules later showed up in Thor's solo title a few years later, beating Thor in a fight as punishment from Odin for loving a mortal named Jane Foster. Ooh. Even though in both cases Hercules is first introduced not as a villain but as a character who can stand against Thor's might, of course they have to fight. That's what happened with Thor and Tony Stark when they first met, and you see how that turned out. Anyway, that's how we see things shaping up for the MCU version of Hercules 2. Zeus is sending him to go ring Thor's bell, and he will, and it'll undoubtedly be a ton of fun. They're going to break a bunch of stuff in the process, but somewhere down the road, Thor and Hercules are going to be buds. In the comics, Hercules goes on to help Thor out a whole bunch, and he eventually becomes an Avenger. When is that going to happen? Well, right now, we don't know. Thor Love and Thunder definitely leaves the MCU wide open for more Thor adventures, and the coda after the post-credits scene even states that Thor will return, which honestly was kind of up in the air. Whether that's a fifth solo movie or another Avengers film, it stands to reason that wherever we see the God of Thunder after this, there's a pretty good chance he's going to go head-to-head with Hercules in that story, even if it's just so they can, duke it out for a second and then become friends later. But of course, that was just the first of 2 post-credit scenes. There's the one at the very end, and that's the Valhalla scene. Jane Foster has passed away, but her spirit has reawoken in Valhalla. How do we know that? Because Idris Elba's Heimdall is right there to greet her, and he's like, "Welcome to Valhalla. Hey, what's up?" And that's basically it. The credits end, we learn that Thor will return, and that's the end of the movie. The Valhalla scene is a heartwarming bookend to Jane's story. She dies heroically, sacrificing herself to save the children, basically as she's immortalized as the Mighty Thor, aka Dr. Jane Foster in statue form in New Asgard. So Jane definitely died a hero, but the Valhalla scene explains that yes, she is as dead as Heimdall is, but at least her passing is not truly the end of her story. Earlier, when Thor and Korg investigated the death of Falagar the Behemoth and run into Lady Sif, she's pissed off that she's not waking up in Valhalla because that means that she didn't die in battle valiantly. And Korg jokes that her arm probably is in Valhalla because her arm died in battle, and that's how she lost it. And this leads us to an interesting theory involving Valhalla. What about Loki? Not 2012 Loki, who's currently goofing around with variants in the TVA. I'm talking about Loki Prime, the one who died in Avengers Infinity War. Did he wind up in Valhalla? He died during a fight. He died at the hands of an enemy combatant, literally died in Thanos' hands, and he did so as he was fighting himself, trying to slay Thanos the Titan with a hidden dagger. And all of this is after he helped Thor save all the Asgardians in Ragnarok. Don't get me wrong, Loki Prime really is the worst brother, but his final acts were valiant ones, and based on the basic Valhalla rules put out there in Love and Thunder, we think he's probably up there too. But I digress. Jane and Heimdall showing up in Valhalla is most likely a simple goodbye to both characters, so we may never get to find out. But if Gorr was able to resurrect his daughter by reaching eternity, maybe it's not out of the question that Thor could eventually do the same thing and bring those 2 characters back. Also, if there is a multiverse and there are a ton of Loki variants, are there multiple versions of Valhalla? I think we may be overthinking this a little bit. Realistically, this was probably an excuse to give Jane a proper send-off in a better movie than Thor: The Dark World.
These hands were once used for battle. Now they're but humble tools for peace.
Anytime a new MCU movie or Disney Plus show comes along, we always have to try to extrapolate where things are going next, and when it comes to Thor, the door is wide open. Like we mentioned earlier, Thor's story is still totally viable for more movies. At the end of Avengers Endgame, he heads off into space for adventures with the Asgardians of the Galaxy, and he kind of ends this movie the same way, except instead of a ship full of a-holes, he's palling around with Love, who's Gorr's resurrected daughter. So that means the duo will go on all kinds of fun space adventures, and the next Thor film could be a literal Love and Thunder movie. Our best guess is the next time we see Thor or Love will probably be the next time the Avengers have to assemble. I mean, keep in mind at this point, the Avengers don't really exist. Tony's dead, Cap is old, and Thor, we just discussed Thor a whole bunch. Even if it's not the Avengers assembling, the God of Thunder's next outing could be whenever there's an existence-level threat that needs a group of gifted individuals to work together to fight the battles too big to handle solo. Right now, with all the threats the MCU has placed on the table since Endgame, the most likely candidate for that existence-level threat still has to be Kang the Conqueror. Introduced in Loki, Kang is also set to appear in Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania in 2023, and since Kang was one of the original comic book Avengers villains, if a new version of Earth's mightiest heroes has to reassemble with Thor, this guy seems like a pretty safe target. Also out in 2023, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, and before that I think we're getting a holiday special, and Thor isn't supposed to properly appear in either of those, but the guy basically hijacked Star-Lord's whole ship and crew for a little while, so maybe he'll drop by for the holidays with a flagon of eggnog to hang some tinsel on Groot, who knows? The Marvel Cinematic Universe has been a little all over the place in Phase 4, trying to establish a new status quo after the universe-altering events of Avengers Endgame, and Thor: Love and Thunder is really no different. Thor has been in a constant state of change at least since his first MCU solo movie in 2011, and the end of this film once again wipes the slate clean so that Marvel Studios can send the character in any direction they want, as long as there's a contract. Chris Hemsworth's contract with Marvel Studios supposedly ends with Thor: Love and Thunder, so if they want to keep the one remaining member of the Avengers Big Three, they'll need to strike a new deal with Hemsworth. But I guess the big revelation of Thor: Love and Thunder is that one post-credit sentence that Thor will return. We just don't know where or when.
I just want to say that was very, very impressive what you did back there.
And of course, now we gotta run through all of the Easter eggs we found, and there's a bunch of them, so let's do this. Lots of Easter eggs in Omnipotent City, but we'll start with the big ones. Celestials! Several Celestials appear in the movie, but there's definitely a few in Omnipotent City, and then we see some other ones where Gorr builds his gateway to eternity, but there's still no mention of the big Celestial head and hand that are jutting out of the earth that we saw in Eternals. They haven't talked about that yet. Ra, the most powerful member of the Egyptian pantheon, or the Aeneid as Moon Knight calls it, is also part of the Omnipotent City gang. Also present in Omnipotent City, Maori gods. Korg's rock species god, Ninni of the Nani, is sitting on a throne made of scissors. This implies the existence of a paper species that could theoretically defeat Korg. Here's one for you art majors. The art style of Omnipotent City seems to be based on the painting Spring by Alma Tadema. Anyway, moving on, the Necrosword that chooses Gorr is a bit different in the comics. All black, the Necrosword is major canon for symbiotes and actually is a symbiote itself. And yes, we mean those symbiotes, like Venom-style symbiotes. Null, the eldritch god and creator of all symbiotes, also created All Black, the first symbiote, and Necrosword formed of living abyss. The weapon is especially strong versus the Divine, or gods. Its main comics wielders are Null, Gorr the God Butcher, and yep, Allfather Thor, though he later destroys it. When Thor imbues the children of New Asgard with his own power, it spreads among them in the shape of Yggdrasil, the sacred tree central to Norse mythology, and several Thor legends. There are several statues in the portal to Eternity Room, including the three-headed living tribunal, Uatu the Watcher, who is major in What If, and what appears to be Lady Death, the character that comics Thanos did his whole wipe out half the universe thing for. Jane Foster references Interstellar, explaining the wormhole theory from it with a piece of paper and a pencil, and she also thought the movie was clear and simple to understand, so make of that what you will. She also name-checks Event Horizon, which stars Sam Neill, who is another Kiwi like Taika, who actually played Odin during the stage production in New Asgard. Darcy Lewis returns. We first met Darcy in the Thor solo films, and most recently she was running around Westview with Vision in WandaVision. And speaking of old science friends, Jane is still friends/colleagues with Dr. Erik Selvig, also from the Thor films, who helped Loki's army invade Earth in the Avengers, but for the most part is one of Stellan Skarsgård's least evil roles. When Thor puts an enchantment on Mjolnir to protect Jane, it's just like when Odin placed an enchantment for whosoever holds this hammer, if he be worthy, shall possess the power of Thor. At one point in the movie, Korg misidentifies Jane Foster as the real-world actress Jane Fonda. Gorr refers to Jane Mighty Thor as Lady Thor, like a lot of the internet did when the comics character was revealed, and she's quick and brutal about correcting him. It's the Mighty Thor or Dr. Jane Foster. In the comics, the Shadow Realm, where there's no color, is a parallel dimension under the rule of Warlord Ka, who has fought Hulk in the past by possessing his shadow. Heimdall apparently had a son, Astrid, a.k.a. Axel, who was never mentioned before in the movie, in the comics, or in mythology. Lucky for him and the other kids, though, he inherited his proud papa's cool eye powers that let him communicate with Thor, who ultimately saves the kids. Speaking of superhero kiddos, two of Chris Hemsworth's kids appear in Love and Thunder. The young Thor, shown in the intro, is one of Hemsworth's twin sons, and Love is played by his real-life daughter, India Rose. And actually, it turns out this movie was a family affair for just about everybody involved. In a recent interview, Hemsworth said that Christian Bale, Natalie Portman, and Taika Waititi all had children appearing in the film. And really, there were a lot of kids running around, so not that surprising. Revolution expert Korg finds love when he falls in love with Dwayne The Rock.
It's about drive, it's about power. We stay hungry, we devour.
But apparently there are no Johnsons involved because Korg's species procreates by holding hands for several weeks in a pool of lava. There's a Cocktails and Dreams neon sign on the new Asgardian barge, and this is the bar chain that Tom Cruise's character works at in the 1988 film Cocktail. The story framing conceit of Korg telling the story of Thor to a cave full of children is taken directly from the famous Australian movie Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome. So the crazy screaming goats are in the entire movie, and they're not really consequential to the plot in any sense, but in the comics and in Norse mythology, Thor did indeed have two goats, Tooth Grinder and Tooth Gnasher, and the ones in the movie are just goofy references to these, probably. Unless they show up being really central to Phase 5. I don't know. What did you think of Thor Love and Thunder, and where will we see Hercules pop up again? And is there a Loki in Valhalla? Let us know what you think in the comments below. As always, thank you for watching this episode of Canon Fodder. I'm Max Scoville, and for a big old refresher on the God of Thunder, check out how he went from a bleached eyebrows Asgardian to the funniest Avenger. And don't forget to follow and subscribe to IGN wherever you like to watch. I'll see you next time, true believers. Excelsior!